They called her a monster before she ever spoke a word. But Caleb Thornfield knew something was wrong the moment he saw her eyes in the dark. Not wild, not angry, just hungry in a way no animal ever was. And out here, hunger meant one thing. Something had been pushed too far to survive. The wind dragged across the plains like a warning that night, carrying dust through the cracks of his old wooden barn. The lantern by the door flickered low, casting long shadows that bent and stretched across the ground. And Caleb almost turned back, almost chose the silence he had lived with for 12 long years. Because silence was safe. Silence didn't ask questions, didn't change anything. But then he heard it again, a faint sound. Not quite a voice, not quite a breath, something in between, something that didn't belong to the land he knew. He stepped closer, boots slow against the dirt, one hand resting near his belt out of habit, not fear. Just the kind of caution a man learns when the world has taken enough from him already. And that's when he saw her, curled near the fence like something abandoned, thin shoulders shaking under fabric that didn't match any cloth he had ever seen. Not cotton, not wool, something softer. Almost like it caught the light instead of reflecting it. Her hair fell across her face, dark and tangled, and for a second, just a second, Caleb thought she might already be gone. Another body the desert would claim without asking. But then her fingers moved, slow, weak, reaching not for him, not for anything, just reaching, like she didn't understand what it meant to stop. He crouched down, careful, watching for any sign of danger, any sign that this was something else, something that could turn on him. But there was nothing, no threat, no tension, just exhaustion so deep it felt heavier than the air itself. And when her eyes finally opened, everything inside him went still. They weren't like any eyes he had seen, not in the color, not in the way they caught the lantern light and held it, like there was something behind them, something thinking, something watching him just as closely as he was watching her. And in that moment, Caleb understood one thing clear as daylight. She wasn't from anywhere this land could name. The stories men told in saloons, the quiet warnings passed between travelers, the things people laughed about until they saw them standing in front of them, breathing, real, and still. He didn't step back, didn't reach for his gun, didn't call it what the world would call it. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He stayed, her lips parted slightly, dry, cracked, and when she tried to speak, no sound came out. Just air, thin and fragile, like the word itself had forgotten how to exist. Caleb swallowed, the taste of dust thick in his mouth. He knew what would happen if anyone else found her first. This land didn't forgive what it didn't understand. It didn't wait for answers. It made decisions fast and lived with them longer than it should. He had seen it before. The way a crowd could turn something unknown into something feared, and something feared into something that needed to disappear. And for a second, just a second, he let himself think about walking away, about turning his back and letting the night take her like it took everything else out here. It would be easier, cleaner, safer. No questions, no consequences, just another silence added to all the others he carried. But then her hand moved again, this time catching the edge of his coat, barely enough strength to hold on, barely enough to ask without asking. And that was all it took. Caleb let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man already knows the choice is made before he admits it to himself. He slipped off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, feeling the cold in her skin, not the kind that comes from weather, something deeper, something that didn't belong to this world at all. And when he lifted her, she didn't resist, didn't flinch, just leaned into him like she had been waiting for something solid to exist. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open, the smell of hay and leather filling the air, familiar, grounding, human, everything she wasn't. And as he set her down, near the small fire inside, the lantern light caught something hanging at her neck, a small object, faintly glowing, pulsing like it had its own quiet heartbeat. Caleb paused, eyes narrowing slightly. He had lived long enough to know that nothing out here glowed without reason, nothing carried light unless it meant to be seen. And yet, he didn't touch it, didn't ask, not yet. Instead, he reached for a canteen, lifting it to her lips, watching as she hesitated for half a second before drinking, slow at first, then faster, like her body remembered what survival meant before her mind did. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying something new with it, distant, faint, but enough to make Caleb glance toward the horizon, the kind of feeling that sits in a man's chest. Before trouble ever shows its face, he looked back at her, at the way her breathing had steadied, at the way those strange eyes watched him now, not with fear, not with confusion, but with something else, something he couldn't name yet. And that's when he realized the truth settling quietly into place. This wasn't just a night. This wasn't just a stranger. Whatever he had brought into his world, whatever choice he had just made, it wasn't going to leave the same way it came. And out here, the things that stayed always changed everything. The fire burned low, steady, the kind of quiet warmth that usually meant safety. But Caleb did not feel safe as he sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees, watching every breath she took like it might explain something the world had never taught him. Outside the barn, the wind kept moving, brushing against the wood in long, restless strokes, and somewhere far off a loose gate tapped softly, back and forth, like time refusing to stand still. She had not spoken again after the water, not a word, not a sound. But her eyes stayed on him now, clearer than before, sharper, like whatever had been fading inside her was slowly returning. And that alone unsettled him more than anything else, because weakness he understood, but recovery without reason was something else entirely. He reached for a piece of dried bread from the small sack near the wall and held it out, not too close, not forcing it, just offering, the way you would with something that might run if you moved too fast. She looked at it, then at him, then back again, studying not the food but the space between them. And after a long second, she reached forward, her hand trembling slightly as her fingers closed around it. The moment she took the first bite, Caleb noticed something he could not ignore, the way her body seemed to respond instantly, not just easing, but shifting, like it had been waiting for that exact moment to begin repairing itself. He frowned slightly, leaning back, his eyes drifting again to the faint glow at her neck. It pulsed once, soft, almost like it reacted to the food, to the act of survival itself, and he felt a slow, steady weight settle in his chest, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is looking at something he does not understand and cannot explain away. She finished the bread faster than he expected, then looked at him again, not with hunger this time, but with something quieter, something searching. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the still air. "You got a name?" he asked, voice low, careful. She blinked, just once, then tilted her head slightly, like the words were familiar but not fully formed inside her yet. He waited, patient, not pushing. After a moment, her lips moved, slow, deliberate, and the sound that came out was soft, almost fragile. "Lyra," she said, the name settling into the space between them like it had always belonged there. Caleb nodded once, more to himself than to her. "Lyra," he repeated, testing it, grounding it, giving it weight. She watched him closely as he spoke, and for the first time since he found her, something shifted in her expression, not fear, not confusion, but recognition, as if hearing her name from someone else meant something more than just sound. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "All right, Lyra," he said quietly, "you are a long way from wherever you came from." She did not answer, but her gaze dropped briefly to the ground, then back up again, and that small movement told him more than any words could have. She knew it too, knew she did not belong here, knew this place would not understand her, and still, she had nowhere else to go. The fire cracked softly, a small shift in the wood, and Caleb stood, moving to add another piece. The simple act giving his hand something to do while his mind worked through things it could not quite settle. He had lived his life by a set of rules that kept him alive. Keep your distance, trust what you can see, do not invite trouble where it does not already exist. And yet here he was, sitting in a barn with a girl who had appeared out of nowhere, wearing something that should not exist, carrying a light that did not belong to any world he knew. And instead of sending her away, he was feeding her, speaking to her, saying her name like it mattered. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it, just the weight of a man stepping further into something he could not walk back from. Lyra shifted slightly, pulling the coat tighter around herself, and for a moment, she looked almost ordinary, almost like any other girl caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But then the light at her neck flickered again, a little brighter this time, and the illusion broke just enough to remind him, Nothing about this was ordinary. Nothing about her was something the world would accept. And that thought brought another with it, slower, heavier. People would notice, maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but out here, nothing stayed hidden for long. A stranger, a girl, someone new on his land. Word would travel. It always did. And when it did, it would not come quietly. It would come with questions, with looks, with the kind of attention that did not stop until it found something to settle on. He glanced toward the open edge of the barn, where the darkness stretched out beyond the fence line, and for the first time that night, he felt something he had not allowed himself in years. Not fear, not exactly, but anticipation, the sense that something was already moving toward him, something set in motion the moment he chose to stay. Lyra followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she felt it too. That shift in the air, that quiet warning carried on the wind. And then, slowly, she looked back at him, and in that look, there was no confusion anymore, no hesitation, just a quiet understanding, as if she knew. Something he did not yet, something about what came next, and Caleb realized, sitting there in the dim light of a dying fire, that whatever path he had stepped onto, he was not the only one walking it, and he was not the one leading. Morning did not arrive all at once out here. It crept in slow, thin lines of pale light stretching across the land like something testing whether it was welcome, and Caleb was already awake when the first hint of it touched the edge of the barn door. He had not slept much, not with the weight of the night sitting heavy in his chest, and the quiet presence of someone who should not exist resting only a few feet away. The fire had burned down to embers, faint and red, barely holding on, and the air carried that early chill that always came before the sun claimed the sky. He stood slowly, careful not to make sudden noise, his joints stiff from the hard ground, and for a moment he simply watched her. Lyra lay curled where he had left her, the coat still wrapped around her, but something was different now, not in the way she looked, but in the way the space around her felt, steadier, fuller, like whatever had been fragile the night before had begun to anchor itself into this world. Her breathing was even, calm, and the faint glow at her neck pulsed in a slow rhythm that matched it, not bright, not demanding, just present, like a quiet heartbeat that did not belong to any creature he had ever known. Caleb stepped outside, the wood creaking softly under his boots, and the morning air hit him clean and sharp, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant earth. He ran a hand along the fence as he walked, grounding himself in something familiar, something real. The cattle in the far field shifted lazily, unaware that anything had changed, unaware that the world had tilted just slightly during the night. And for a second, Caleb envied them. The simplicity of a life that did not ask questions, that did not force you to choose between what made sense and what felt right. He leaned against the post, eyes scanning the horizon out of habit, and that was when he saw it. Not close, not immediate, but there, a thin line of dust rising far off along the main trail, faint but steady, the kind that meant movement, the kind that meant people. He narrowed his eyes slightly, measuring distance the way he always did, miles out, maybe more, but heading this direction, and the weight in his chest shifted, not heavier, just clearer. It had begun. Whatever quiet he had been given during the night was already slipping away. He pushed himself off the post and turned back toward the barn, his steps quicker now, more certain. When he stepped inside, Lyra was awake, sitting upright where she had been lying, the coat still around her shoulders, her eyes already on him as if she had known the moment he moved. There was no confusion in them now, no weakness, just awareness, sharp and steady, and something else beneath it, something that felt almost like recognition of what he had not yet said. He paused a few feet away, studying her. "You sleep all right?" he asked, the words simple, ordinary, something to bridge the distance between them. She tilted her head slightly, as if testing the meaning again, then nodded once, small but certain. "Good," he said quietly, his voice lower than usual, not out of caution, but because something about her presence made loud words feel unnecessary. He reached for the canteen again, offering it, and she took it without hesitation this time, her movements more sure, more human in a way that unsettled him even more than before. He watched as she drank, then lowered it, her gaze drifting past him toward the open barn door, toward the light beginning to stretch across the ground. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the coat. And for the first time since he had found her, she spoke without being asked. "They are coming." Her voice was still soft, still carrying that strange, careful rhythm. But there was no doubt in it, no uncertainty. Caleb did not turn right away, did not rush to look. He had already seen it, already felt it. Instead, he kept his eyes on her. "Who is coming?" he asked, not because he expected a clear answer, but because the question needed to exist. She was quiet for a moment, searching for the words, or maybe deciding how much to say. Then her gaze returned to his, not like before, not uncertain, but steady, like someone who understood more than they should. "The ones who follow what I carry," she said, and her hand lifted slightly, touching the faintly glowing object at her neck. The light pulsed once, brighter than before, and Caleb felt that same quiet shift inside him, the one that had started the moment he chose not to walk away. He exhaled slowly, nodding once, more to himself than to her. "All right," he said, voice calm, grounded, the kind of calm that comes from a man who has already made his decision before the question is fully asked. "Then we do not give them a reason to think they belong here." Lyra watched him closely, her expression unreadable for a second. Then something softened, not weakness, not relief, but something closer to trust and outside. The line of dust on the horizon grew just a little more defined, a little closer, the kind of change most people would not notice until it was too late. But Caleb Thornfield had never been most people, and as the morning light stretched further across the land, he understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever was coming, it was not just looking for her, it was looking for a choice. And he had already made it. The sun climbed higher, slow but certain, stretching light across every inch of the ranch as if nothing had changed. But Caleb knew better. The world did not shift with noise out here. It shifted in quiet ways first, in the way the wind carried something new, in the way a man felt watched before he ever saw who was doing the watching. He stood just outside the barn now, one hand resting against the wood, eyes fixed on the horizon where the thin line of dust had grown thicker, clearer, no longer something you could mistake for wind. Alone, it was movement, deliberate, steady, and coming straight toward him. Behind him, he could feel Lyra before he heard her, the soft step of her bare feet against the dirt, lighter than any sound he had ever known, but present in a way that made ignoring it impossible. She stopped a few feet back, not beside him, not hiding, just there, like she understood distance in a way most people never did. Caleb did not turn at first, did not need to. "How far?" he asked quietly, still watching the line in the distance. Lyra's voice came after a moment, softer than the wind but sharper than silence, closer than they should be. He nodded once, not surprised, not anymore. He had already decided this was not a question of if, but when, and when had arrived sooner than most men would be ready for. But readiness had never mattered much out here. Only what you did when the moment came. He pushed off the wall and stepped forward into the open yard, boots pressing into the dry earth, grounding himself in something solid, something that would not change no matter what walked over the horizon. The cattle shifted again in the distance, restless now, picking up on something in the air that even they could not name. Caleb reached up, adjusting the brim of his hat slightly, not to hide his face, but to settle into the habit of a man who had faced enough to know posture mattered more than words. Behind him, Lyra stepped forward once, then stopped again, as if measuring the space between them, her fingers brushing lightly against the object at her neck. And for a brief second, the glow brightened, not enough to be seen from far away, but enough for Caleb to notice. His eyes flicked toward it, then back to the horizon. "What happens if they catch up?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying weight he did not show. Lyra was quiet, longer this time, as if the answer was not something she could place into the shape of words easily. Then finally, she spoke. "They do not stop." Caleb let that sit in the air for a moment, not reacting, not questioning further, because he understood what was not said. Not stopping did not always mean force. Sometimes it meant persistence, certainty, the kind of pursuit that did not end until it reached its conclusion, no matter how long it took. He exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing just slightly as the figures on the horizon began to take form, still too far to see clearly, but no longer just shadows and dust. He turned then, finally, Looking at Lyra fully in the daylight for the first time, the light revealed more than the lantern ever could. The way her skin carried a tone that did not quite match the sun. The way her eyes held that same depth even in full brightness. And the way she stood, not like someone lost, but like someone placed, as if being here, in this moment, was not an accident. "You trust me?" he asked, the words quiet, not demanding, not even expecting an answer, just placing the question between them. Lyra met his gaze without hesitation, and for the first time, there was no searching in her expression, no uncertainty, only something clear and steady. "I chose you," she said, and the simplicity of it settled heavier than any explanation ever could. Caleb held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded once. That was enough, more than enough. He turned back toward the horizon just as the first shapes of riders became distinct. 3 figures, maybe 4, moving at a pace that was not rushed, not urgent, but intentional, the kind of approach that assumed it would not be stopped. Caleb stepped forward another pace, placing himself between the barn and the open land, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just where he needed to be. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of movement now, distant but real, and behind him, Lyra did not move, did not step back, did not hide. She simply stood there, the light at her neck pulsing. Once more, steady, calm, and Caleb realized something then, something that settled deep and quiet inside him. This was not about defending something fragile. This was about standing beside something that had already decided it would not run. The riders drew closer, the dust rising around them in soft clouds that caught the sunlight, and the space between what was known and what was coming grew thinner with every passing second. Caleb rested his hand loosely at his side, not reaching, not preparing, just ready in the way a man becomes when he stops asking what happens next and accepts that whatever it is, he will meet it standing. And as the distance closed, one thought remained clear, simple, and unshaken. Whatever they had come for, they were going to find more than they expected, because this land might have been empty yesterday, but today, it belonged to a choice that was not going to step aside. They did not slow down as they approached, and that told Caleb everything he needed to know. Men who planned to talk usually gave space, but men who already believed they had the right to be somewhere they stopped just short of the fence line, not because they had to, but because they chose to, and that choice carried more weight than any words could have. 3 riders, maybe 4, their shapes now clear in the morning light, dust settling slowly around them as their horses shifted under the sun. Caleb did not move to greet them, did not step forward. He simply stood where he was, one hand resting loosely at his side, his posture steady, the kind of stillness that made a man harder to read than any threat ever could. Behind him, Lyra remained near the barn, not hidden, not exposed, just present, and that presence seemed to stretch across the space between them and the riders in a way that changed the air itself. The lead rider tilted his head slightly, studying Caleb first, not the land, not the barn, but the man, as if measuring something that could not be seen at a distance. Then his gaze shifted, just briefly, past Caleb's shoulder, and something in his posture adjusted, not fear, not surprise, but recognition, subtle and immediate, like finding what you had been looking for without needing confirmation. Caleb noticed it. Of course he did, and that small shift told him more than any introduction ever would. They were not here by accident, not passing through, not lost. They had come with purpose, and that purpose had a name he now understood. "You lost," Caleb said finally, his voice carrying across the quiet yard, calm, even, not challenging, just placing the first word into a space that had been waiting for it. The lead rider did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced again toward Lyra, then back to Caleb, and when he spoke, his tone was measured, not unfriendly, but not open either. "We are looking for something that does not belong here." Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough to show, just enough to settle his stance deeper into the ground beneath him. "Things belong where they end up," he replied, simple, direct, the kind of answer that did not invite argument but did not avoid it either. The rider's eyes narrowed a fraction, not in anger, but in consideration, as if the response had not been what he expected. Behind Caleb, Lyra took a single step forward, just one, and that small movement was enough to draw every eye to her. The light at her neck pulsed once, brighter than before, catching the sunlight in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The second rider shifted slightly in his saddle, not reaching for anything, not reacting outwardly, but the movement carried awareness, like a line had just been drawn where there had been none before. Caleb did not turn, did not look back at her. He did not need to. He could feel the shift, could feel the way the moment had tightened around all of them. The lead rider spoke again, slower this time. That is what we are here for. The girl. The word hung in the air, but it did not land the way it was meant to. Not fragile, not uncertain. Just a word that no longer fit what stood behind Caleb. He let out a quiet breath, his gaze steady. She is not something you misplaced, he said, and there was no anger in it. No raised voice, just a statement placed where it needed to be. The rider's expression changed then, just slightly, not frustration, not yet, but something closer to recalculating, as if the path he expected to walk had shifted under his feet. Lyra's voice came then, soft but clear, cutting through the space in a way that did not belong to volume. I am not lost, she said, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her words, no searching, just certainty. The riders went still, not frozen, but focused, their attention narrowing completely now, no longer divided between land and man and distance. Everything centered on her. Caleb felt it, the way the weight of the moment shifted away from him and settled on her instead. And without thinking, without planning, he took a half step forward, just enough to stand more fully between her and them, not blocking, not hiding, just present in the way that made his choice visible without needing to be spoken. The lead rider's eyes flicked to that movement, then back to Caleb's face, and for a second, something like understanding passed through his expression, quiet, almost reluctant. You do not know what you are standing in front of, he said, not as a threat, not as a warning shouted across distance, but as something closer to truth, something offered. Instead of forced, Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line, and when he answered, his voice was just as steady as before. Maybe not, he said, but I know what I am standing for. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, stretched tight between them like something waiting to break or bend. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the last of the dust away from the rider's boots. And somewhere in that stillness, something changed, not outwardly, not in a way anyone could point to, but in the quiet understanding that whatever had brought these men here was no longer the only force shaping what would happen next, because now there was something else in the middle of it, something that had not been part of their plan, a man who had already chosen, and a girl who no longer intended to run. And as the seconds passed without anyone moving, Caleb realized the truth settling in deeper than before. This was not going to be decided by who arrived, but by who was willing to stay. No one moved, and that was the part that mattered most, because out here, movement meant decision, and decision meant consequence. And every man standing in that quiet yard knew it. Even if none of them said it out loud, the wind slowed, like it was waiting too, and Caleb could feel the weight of 3 pairs of eyes shifting between him and Lyra, measuring not just what they saw, but what they could not yet understand. The lead rider adjusted slightly in his saddle, not in discomfort, but in thought, as if the path he had come prepared to walk had just split into something unfamiliar. You are making this harder than it needs to be, he said finally, his voice calm, almost patient, like someone explaining something simple to a man who refused to listen. Caleb did not respond right away, his gaze steady, his stance unchanged, because he understood something the rider did not. This was not about difficulty. This was about direction, and he had already chosen his. Lyra stepped forward then, not past Caleb, not in front of him, but beside him, just enough that the space between them closed without either one claiming it. And that small shift carried more meaning than any words either of them could have spoken. The riders noticed, of course they did, their attention narrowing again, focusing on her, not as something fragile, but as something central, something that could not be ignored. You do not belong here, the second rider said, quieter than the first, but sharper, like the edge of a thought that had already been made. Lyra's head tilted slightly, her expression calm, almost curious, as if the idea itself was worth examining rather than rejecting. Where is here? She asked, her voice steady now, clearer than it had been before, and for a moment, the question hung in the air in a way none of them had expected, because it did not challenge, It did not argue. It simply existed. The rider did not answer right away, and that hesitation spoke louder than anything he could have said. Caleb felt it too. The shift, the way the ground under the conversation had changed just enough to make certainty harder to hold on to. This land, the lead rider said finally, gesturing slightly with one hand, controlled, deliberate, like he was placing a boundary that had always been there. Lyra followed the motion with her eyes, then looked down briefly at the ground beneath her feet, the dust, the dry earth, the same ground Caleb had walked his entire life, and when she looked back up, there was something different in her gaze, something settled, something chosen. "I am standing on it," she said, and the simplicity of it landed in a way that no argument could undo. Caleb felt a quiet shift inside his chest, not relief, not pride, just recognition. She was not asking for permission anymore. She was defining something for herself, and that changed everything. The third rider shifted slightly, glancing between the others, then back to Caleb. "You do not understand what follows her," he said, his tone not harsh, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. Caleb let out a slow breath, his eyes never leaving theirs. "Then help me understand," he replied, not as a challenge, not as a refusal, but as an invitation, and that was what surprised them, more than his stance, more than his choice, because men who stood like he did usually did not ask questions. They made statements, they ended things, but Caleb was not ending anything. He was opening it, and that forced them to reconsider the ground they stood on. The lead rider studied him for a long moment, then looked again at Lyra, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, not enough to show weakness, but enough to show thought. "What she carries is not just hers," he said. Slower now, choosing each word carefully. "It draws attention, not just from us." Caleb nodded once, absorbing that, not reacting, just letting it settle into place with everything else he had already accepted. "Attention comes either way," he said quietly. "The difference is what you do with it when it gets here." The silence returned, but it was different now, not tight, not waiting to break, but open, stretching between them in a way that allowed something new to exist inside it. Lyra glanced at Caleb then, just briefly, and in that glance, there was no question, no need for reassurance, only acknowledgement, as if she understood the shape of what he had just done without needing it explained. The riders shifted slightly, not retreating, not advancing, but adjusting, the way men do when they realize the situation they stepped into is not the one they thought they would find. And in that moment, the balance changed. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone could point to, but enough that the outcome was no longer certain, enough that the path forward had more than one direction. Caleb stood there, steady as ever, the sun higher now, casting long, clear light across all of them. And for the first time since the riders had appeared on the horizon, it was not just about who had come or why. It was about what would be chosen next. And as the wind moved softly through the open land, carrying no urgency, no warning, just presence, Caleb understood something with quiet clarity. Whatever followed her, whatever had been set in motion long before she reached his fence, it had not accounted for this, for a man who would not step aside, for a moment that refused to move in the direction expected. And that meant one thing. The story they had come to finish was no longer the only one being told. The silence stretched longer than it should have, and in that silence, something unseen began to take shape, not in the movement of men or horses, but in the space between decisions. The kind of space where outcomes are not forced but chosen. Caleb felt it settle around him like the still air before a storm that never shows itself. And for the first time since the riders arrived, he noticed something else, not in them, but in Lyra. The way she stood had changed, not just steady, but rooted, as if the ground beneath her feet had accepted her in a way it had not before. The faint glow at her neck pulsed again, stronger this time, and the light did not flicker like before. It held, calm and deliberate. The lead rider saw it too, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition that had deepened into something more complex, almost like respect. "You feel it now, do you not?" he said, his voice quieter, no longer directed only at Caleb, but at both of them. Caleb did not answer, not because he did not understand, but because he was listening to something else, something he could not hear with his ears, a shift in the air, a change in the way the land seemed to settle. Lyra took a slow breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that had not been there before. "It is not following me anymore," she said, the words soft, but carrying weight that altered the meaning of everything that had come. Before, the riders exchanged brief glances, subtle, controlled, but enough to show that this was not expected, not part of the path they had been walking. The second rider leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on her now. "What does that mean?" he asked, not sharply, but with a precision that suggested the answer mattered more than anything else they had said so far. Lyra did not rush, did not hesitate. She simply looked down at the object at her neck, the light steady now, no longer pulsing in uncertainty, then back at them. "It means I stopped running," she said, and for a moment, no one spoke, because that answer did not explain anything, and yet it explained everything. Caleb felt it settle into him the same way her earlier words had, not as information, but as truth, something that did not need to be broken apart to be understood. The lead rider let out a slow breath, his posture easing just slightly, not in surrender, but in adjustment, as if the shape of the situation had changed and he was choosing to meet it where it now stood. "Then you have already done what we came for," he said, and this time, there was no claim in his voice, no attempt to take anything back, just acknowledgement. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in focus. "You came to bring her back," he said, the words simple, direct. The rider shook his head once, small, controlled. "We came to see if she would choose a place," he replied, and that shifted something deeper, something that reached beyond the moment and into everything that had led to it. Lyra looked at Caleb then, fully this time, and there was something in her gaze that had not been there before, not just recognition, not just trust, but something closer to belonging, not claimed, not given, but chosen. And Caleb understood, without needing it said, that whatever had been following her was never meant to take her. It was meant to test her, to see if she would remain something that moved without direction or become something that stood. The third rider exhaled softly, glancing toward the horizon behind them, as if confirming something only they could see. "It will not come now," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, not relaxing, but settling, and the question that had been forming since the beginning finally found its place. "Then why are you still here?" he asked. The lead rider looked at him, really looked this time, not measuring, not judging, just seeing. "Because now the choice is yours," he said, and that was the moment everything became clear, not in a loud way, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the quiet understanding that settled between them all. This had never been about taking Lyra away. It had been about whether she would be left alone or stand beside someone who would not let her be seen as something to be taken at all. The riders began to turn their horses then, not in retreat, not in defeat, but in completion, the kind of movement that comes when a task has reached its end without needing to be forced. The dust lifted again beneath them, softer now, less urgent, and as they rode away, the space they left behind did not feel empty. It felt settled, like something had found its place in a way the land itself understood. Caleb stood there for a moment longer, watching until they were nothing more than shapes against the horizon again. Then he turned, slowly, back toward Lyra. She had not moved, not once, and the light at her neck had dimmed slightly, no longer needing to shine as brightly, because whatever it had been signaling was no longer searching. Caleb met her eyes, and for the first time since this had begun, there was no question left between them, only the quiet weight of what came next. He nodded once, not asking, not offering, just acknowledging, and Lyra stepped forward, closing the small distance between them, not as someone seeking shelter, but as someone choosing where to stand. And in that moment, with the sun high and the land stretching endless around them, Caleb realized something simple and final. Nothing had been taken from him, nothing had been forced upon him, but something had been placed in his life that he could either turn away from or accept fully. And the way she stood there, steady, certain, made the answer feel less like a decision and more like something that had been waiting for him all along. The riders were gone, but the silence they left behind was not the same as before. It was heavier, settled, like the land itself had witnessed something and chosen to remember it. Caleb stood still for a long moment after they disappeared into the horizon, his eyes tracing the empty trail as if expecting it to change its mind and bring them back. But nothing returned. Only the wind, soft now, carrying no urgency, no warning. Just the quiet truth that whatever had been approaching had already passed. Behind him, Lyra remained where she was. But something about her presence had shifted again, not in strength, not in posture, but in the way she occupied the space, as if she no longer needed to measure it, no longer needed to ask where she stood. Caleb finally turned, slow, deliberate, his boots pressing into the dry earth with a sound that felt louder than it should have. He studied her for a second, not searching for answers anymore, just seeing what was in front of him for what it was. "You all right?" he asked, the words simple, almost unnecessary, but spoken anyway. Lyra nodded once, her gaze steady, but there was something new in it, something that had not been there the night before, not just awareness, but calm, the kind that comes when something uncertain settles into place. "They will not return," she said quietly, and Caleb believed her, not because of the words, but because of the way she said them, without doubt, without hesitation, like someone who understood the shape of what had just ended. He exhaled slowly, running a hand along the back of his neck, the tension he had not acknowledged beginning to loosen in small, quiet ways. "Good," he said, though the word felt smaller than what it needed to hold. They stood there for a moment longer, the distance between them unchanged, but no longer uncertain. And then Caleb did something he had not done since this began. He turned away from the horizon completely, turning his back on it, as if to say whatever it carried no longer held his attention. He walked toward the barn, not checking if she would follow, not asking, just moving. And after a second, he heard it, the soft step behind him, light, steady, certain. He did not look back, did not need to. The sound alone told him everything he needed to know. Inside the barn, the air was warmer now, the last of the morning chill pushed out by the rising sun. Caleb moved to the workbench, picking up a piece of worn cloth and setting it down again without using it, his hands searching for something to do while his mind caught up with what had already happened. Lyra stepped inside a moment later, her eyes moving across the space slowly, not like before, not scanning for danger, but taking it in, as if she was learning it, placing it somewhere inside herself. Caleb glanced at her, then at the small fire pit. The embers long faded now. He reached down and began to gather fresh wood, his movements automatic, familiar, and for a moment, everything felt almost ordinary, almost like the morning after any long night, until he realized what was missing: the weight, the tension, the sense of something unresolved. It was gone, not because the situation had disappeared, but because it had changed shape, and that realization settled into him in a way he could not ignore. Lyra stepped closer to the fire pit, watching as he worked, then crouched down slightly, her hand hovering over the unlit wood, and for a brief second, Caleb thought she might touch it, but instead, she pulled her hand back, her fingers curling slightly. As if remembering something, he struck a match, the small flame catching easily, and when he set it to the wood, it took, slow at first, then steady, the fire building in a way that felt grounded, real, human. He sat back on his heels, watching it for a second, then glanced up at her. "You said you chose this place," he said, not looking for confirmation, just giving the thought shape. Lyra nodded once, stepping closer to the warmth. "I chose where I stand," she replied, her voice calm, but carrying more meaning than the words themselves. Caleb leaned back slightly, resting his weight against one hand, and studied her again, not as something unfamiliar, but as something he was beginning to understand in pieces, and those pieces were starting to fit together in ways he had not expected. Out here, choices meant something. They were not just words, they were lines drawn in dust that either held or disappeared with the next wind. And what she had done, what she had said, that was not something that would fade easily. He nodded once, slow, thoughtful. "Then you stay," he said, not asking, not offering, just stating what was already clear. Lyra met his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be explained. And then she nodded, small, certain. Yes, the words settled between them like something final, not heavy, not forced, just right. Caleb looked back at the fire, watching the flames rise a little higher, steady, controlled. And he realized something in that moment that surprised him more than anything else that had happened since the night before. He was not thinking about what might come next, not about who else might arrive, not about what she was or where she came from. He was thinking about the day ahead, about the fence that needed fixing, the cattle that would need water, the simple, ordinary things that made up a life. And for the first time since he found her, those things did not feel interrupted, they felt shared. He glanced at her once more, then back at the fire, and without saying anything else, he reached for another piece of wood, placing it carefully on the growing flame. Because out here, you did not mark the beginning of something with words, you marked it by continuing. And as the fire settled into a steady burn, so did the choice that had been made, quiet, unspoken, but no less real than anything else that lived and breathed on that land. The fire settled into a steady rhythm, and with it, something inside Caleb did the same. Not a feeling he could name, not something loud or sudden, just a quiet alignment. Like two pieces of a life that had never met before finally sharing the same space without resistance. The day moved forward the way it always did out here. Slow, honest, without asking permission from anyone. Sunlight spilled across the open land, turning the dust into gold for a few brief hours, and Caleb found himself stepping back into motion without needing to think about it. He reached for the tools by the wall, worn leather gloves, a coil of wire, the small things that held his world together, and for a moment, he hesitated, not because he did not know what to do, but because he was no longer doing it alone. He glanced toward Lyra. She stood near the doorway of the barn, watching the light stretch across the ground like it was something she had never seen before, or maybe something she had not expected to see again. Her eyes followed the movement of the day with a quiet focus, and when she noticed him looking, she did not look away. She simply waited, as if whatever came next belonged to both of them now. Caleb nodded slightly toward the open yard. "There is work to do," he said, his voice carrying the same calm weight it always had. But now it held something else beneath it, an inclusion that did not need to be explained. Lyra stepped forward without hesitation, the coat still around her shoulders. Though the warmth of the sun had begun to make it unnecessary, she did not ask what kind of work, did not question where or how. She simply followed, and that was enough. They moved out into the yard together, the dry earth firm beneath their feet, the air carrying the faint scent of grass and distant water. Caleb led her toward the fence line where a section had come loose, the wires sagging slightly between two posts that had weathered more years than they should have. He set down the tools, kneeling to examine the break, then glanced up at her. "This keeps things where they are supposed to be," he said, not as instruction, but as explanation. Lyra looked at the fence, then beyond it, her gaze moving across the open land, then back again, her expression thoughtful, as if the idea itself was something she was turning over in her mind. "And what if something does not belong where it was before?" she asked, her voice quiet, but carrying that same clarity it had found earlier. Caleb paused, his hand resting against the worn wood of the post, and for a second, he did not answer, not because he did not have one, but because the question deserved more than the first thought that came to mind. "Then you decide if it stays or moves," he said finally, simple, steady, and when he looked up at her, he saw that she understood, not just the words, but the space behind them. She nodded once, then crouched down beside him. Mirroring his movement without hesitation, he handed her a piece of wire, showing her how to hold it, how to pull it tight, his movements slow, deliberate, not assuming she knew, but not treating her like she could not learn, and she followed, her hands steady, careful, learning the rhythm of something that had always belonged to this place. The work itself was simple, repetitive, but there was something in the act of doing it together that shifted the air around them, something quiet, something grounding, the kind of thing that built without being noticed until it was already there. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft pull of wire, the creak of wood, the distant movement of cattle, and the steady breath of a day that had fully begun. Caleb found himself glancing at her now and then, not out of concern, but out of awareness, the way she moved, the way she adapted, the way she did not hesitate once she understood, and each time, he saw the same thing, not something out of place, not something temporary, but something that was finding its position in a world that had not been built for it, and choosing to stay anyway. When they finished, Caleb stood, brushing the dust from his hands, and looked at the repaired fence. It held, just like it always did when the work Was done right. He nodded once, satisfied, then glanced at Lyra. She remained crouched for a second longer, her hand resting lightly against the wood, as if feeling something through it. Then she stood, turning her gaze toward the open land beyond, and for a moment, the light at her neck flickered, not bright, not urgent, just present, like a quiet reminder of something that had not disappeared, only changed. Caleb noticed it. Of course he did. But this time, he did not focus on it, did not question it, because whatever it meant, it was no longer something chasing her. It was something she carried by choice, and that made all the difference. He picked up the tools again, turning back toward the barn. "We will need to check the water by the north field," he said, his voice as steady as ever. And as he began to walk, he did not look back to see if she followed, because he already knew she would. And sure enough, a second later, he heard the soft step behind him again, not hesitant, not uncertain, just there, like it had always been. And as they moved across the land together, the distance between what was and what would be grew smaller with every step, not because anything had been forced into place, but because something had been allowed to remain. And out here, that was the closest thing to belonging a person could ever find. By the time they reached the north field, the sun had climbed high enough to press heat into the land. Not harsh, but steady, the kind that reminded a man how long a day could stretch if he let it. Caleb walked ahead as he always did, boots finding the familiar path without needing thought. But now there was a second rhythm behind him, light, consistent, no longer uncertain, and that alone made the distance feel different. The water trough came into view near the low rise, its wooden edges worn smooth by years of use, the surface of the water still, reflecting the sky in a way that made it look deeper than it was. Caleb stepped up beside it, crouching slightly to check the level, then reached down, letting his fingers break the surface. Cool, clean, just as it should be. He nodded to himself, then glanced over his shoulder. Lyra stood a few feet back, her gaze fixed on the water, not in curiosity, but in something quieter, something that felt almost like recognition. "You can drink it," he said, not instructing, just offering. She stepped forward slowly, the ground soft under her feet, and knelt beside him, her reflection appearing beside his in the surface, two shapes sharing the same still space. She studied it for a moment, then reached out, her fingers barely touching the water at first, and when they did, the surface rippled outward, small, controlled circles that spread until they touched the edges and returned again. She watched the movement closely, like it was telling her something she had been waiting to hear. Then she cupped her hands and lifted the water, bringing it to her lips, and for a second, Caleb saw something he had not expected, a softness, not weakness, but a quiet ease, like this simple act connected her to something larger than the moment. He leaned back slightly, resting his weight against his heels, and let the silence settle around them. It was not empty. It carried the sound of wind moving through distant grass, the low shift of cattle somewhere beyond sight, and the steady, quiet breath of the land itself. Lyra lowered her hands, the last drops of water slipping back into the trough, and she remained there for a moment longer, her eyes still on the surface. Then she spoke, not looking at him. "This place does not push me away." Caleb considered that, his gaze drifting across the field, the fence line they had passed, the barn in the distance, small against the open sky. "Most places do not," he said. "It is people who decide that part." She lifted her head slightly, turning just enough to meet his eyes, and there was something in her expression now that had not been there before, not just understanding, but something deeper, something that came from experiencing rather than observing. "Then why did they follow me?" she asked. Caleb exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the edge of the trough, his fingers tracing the worn grain of the wood. "Because you were moving," he said, simple, steady. "And when something keeps moving without choosing where to stand, people try to decide for it." She absorbed that quietly, her gaze drifting back to the water, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The kind of silence that did not need filling, the kind that allowed something to settle without being forced into shape. Then she stood, brushing her hands lightly against the sides of the coat, and looked out across the field again. But this time, her posture was different, not searching, not measuring, just present, as if the land no longer needed to prove anything to her. Caleb pushed himself to his feet, the movement slow, grounded, and followed her gaze. The horizon stretched wide, endless in the way it always had been. But now it felt less like distance and more like possibility. He adjusted his hat slightly, the brim casting a shadow across his eyes. "We should head back before the heat settles in too deep," he said, turning slightly, and again, he did not check if she would follow. He had already learned that part. They began the walk back together, the path the same as before, but the steps felt different. Not just his, but theirs, a rhythm forming without effort, without need for instruction. As they reached the rise near the barn, Caleb slowed slightly, not out of caution, but because something caught his attention. Not a sound, not a movement, but a feeling, subtle, familiar, the kind that came when something shifted just beyond sight. He stopped, turning his head slightly toward the open land behind them, the same direction the riders had disappeared. Lyra stopped too, not because he did, but because she felt it as well, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, the light at her neck flickering once, soft, controlled, not warning, but awareness. They stood there for a moment, both of them listening to something that could not be heard. And then, just as quickly as it came, the feeling passed, the air settling again, the land returning to its quiet, steady presence. Caleb let out a slow breath, not tense, not uneasy, just acknowledging what had moved through and left. He turned back toward the barn, and this time, when he spoke, his voice carried something new, not just steadiness, but certainty. "Whatever comes next, it does not get to decide where you stand." Lyra looked at him, and for a moment, there was no answer, no need for one, because the truth of it had already taken root. She stepped forward again, falling into place beside him, and together, they walked the rest of the way back, not as strangers sharing a path, but as two people who had chosen the same ground. And out here, that choice was stronger than anything that could come looking for them. The afternoon stretched long and quiet across the ranch, the kind of quiet that did not mean nothing was happening, only that everything was settling into its place without needing to announce it. Caleb moved through the yard with the same steady rhythm he had carried for years, checking small things, adjusting what needed adjusting, letting his hands follow habits that had once been built to keep loneliness from settling too deep. But now those same movements felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just shared. Even when no words were spoken, Lyra followed at her own pace, never in the way, never behind for long, always finding a place beside him without asking for it. And each time their paths aligned, it felt less like coincidence and more like something natural, something that did not need to be explained. The sun leaned westward slowly, casting longer shadows that stretched across the land like quiet reminders that every day carried an ending. And Caleb found himself noticing things he had stopped paying attention to years ago. The way the light changed the color of the fence posts, the way the wind shifted direction just before evening, the way a second set of footsteps could alter the sound of a place without making it louder. They returned to the barn as the heat softened, the air cooling just enough to make breathing easier. And Caleb paused at the doorway, resting his hand against the frame as he looked out across the land one more time. Not searching this time, not expecting anything to appear, just looking. Lyra stood just inside, her gaze moving between him and the horizon, as if she was learning both at once. Then she spoke, not with hesitation, but with a quiet certainty that had grown stronger with every hour. "It feels different now." Caleb did not turn right away, his eyes still on the open land. "It is," he said simply, "because it is not just yours or mine anymore." She stepped closer, the floorboards beneath her feet making the faintest sound, and stood beside him, their shoulders not touching, but close enough that the space between them no longer felt empty. She looked out as well, her eyes following the line where the sky met the earth, and for a moment, there was no difference between what he saw and what she saw. Only the same horizon, the same distance, the same quiet promise of something beyond it. Then she asked, "In my world, choosing binds things together. What does it do here?" Caleb considered that, his jaw tightening slightly as he thought. "Out here," he said slowly, "choosing does not bind anything you cannot walk away from, but it makes walking away mean something." Lyra absorbed that, her expression thoughtful, and when she nodded, it was not in agreement, but in understanding, as if she was placing that idea somewhere inside herself where it would remain. The light at her neck flickered again, softer now, almost fading into the background, not gone, but no longer the center of anything. Caleb noticed it. But this time it felt less like a mystery and more like a part of her that no longer needed explanation. He stepped forward into the barn, moving toward the workbench again, setting down the tools he had carried through the day. And for a moment, he simply stood there, looking at his hands, at the small marks and lines that told the story of years spent doing the same things over and over. And he realized something that settled deep and quiet inside him. Those years had not been waiting for something like this, but they had made him the kind of man who would not turn away when it came. Lyra moved to the other side of the space, her fingers brushing lightly against the wood of the wall, the same way she had touched the fence earlier, as if she was learning the shape of the place not just with her eyes, but with something deeper, something that connected her to it in a way that words could not explain. And then she stopped, turning back toward him, her gaze steady, clear. "You did not have to stay," she said, and the words were not a question, not even a statement, just something placed between them to be acknowledged. Caleb met her eyes, his expression unchanged. "I know," he said, and that was all. No explanation, no justification, because there was nothing else to add. The truth of it was enough. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, carrying everything they had not said, everything they had already chosen without needing to speak it aloud. Outside, the light continued to fade, the sky shifting slowly into deeper colors, and the land settled into the kind of stillness that came only at the end of a long day. Caleb moved toward the small fire pit again, striking another match, the flame catching quickly, and as it grew, casting a warm glow across the barn, he glanced up at her, not asking, not inviting, just acknowledging her presence, and she stepped closer, standing within the circle of light without hesitation, without uncertainty. And for a moment, they simply stood there, the fire between them, the quiet stretching out beyond the walls, and everything that had happened settling into something steady, something real. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky beyond the open door, Caleb understood something with quiet clarity. This was not the end of anything, not a conclusion, not a final answer. It was a beginning, not marked by words or promises, but by presence, by the simple act of remaining when leaving would have been easier. And out here, that was the only kind of beginning that ever truly lasted. The night settled over the ranch without hurry, the kind of slow descent that felt less like darkness arriving and more like the world choosing to rest. The fire burned low between them, its light soft now, no longer fighting the dark but existing alongside it. And Caleb sat just outside the barn, one knee raised, his arm resting loosely across it, looking out at the land that had once been nothing more than distance and duty. Lyra sat a few feet away, not apart, not distant, just where she chose to be, her gaze lifted toward the sky where the stars had begun to gather, faint at first, then stronger, one by one, until the whole sky carried them. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be filled. The quiet between them had changed, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting for something to happen. It had become something steady, something that held its own shape. The wind moved gently across the open field, brushing through the grass, carrying with it the same sound it always had, but now it felt different, not empty, not hollow, just full in a way Caleb had not noticed before. He shifted slightly, glancing toward her, and for a second, he saw it clearly, not what she was, not where she came from, but where she stood, here, on this land, under this sky, no longer passing through, no longer searching for something to follow, just present, and that was enough, more than enough. He let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man stops bracing for something that is no longer coming. And in that breath, there was something like peace, not the kind that ends a story, but the kind that lets it continue without resistance. Lyra lowered her gaze from the sky, turning toward him, and in the firelight, her eyes held that same quiet clarity they had found earlier. But now there was something else in them, something softer, something that did not ask or test, only remained. She spoke, her voice calm, almost blending into the sound of the night itself. "In my world, a choice like this would be marked." Caleb tilted his head slightly, studying her. How, he asked, not because he needed to know, but because he wanted to understand the shape of what she was offering. She paused, just long enough to choose the words, then answered. It would be spoken, witnessed, remembered. He nodded once, looking back out at the land. Out here, he said quietly, it is not spoken much. Not unless it needs to be, but it is still witnessed. Lyra followed his gaze, her eyes moving across the darkened field, the fence line barely visible now, the barn casting a long shadow behind them. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something deeper, something settled. Then it has been witnessed. Caleb did not respond right away, not because he disagreed, but because the truth of it did not need an answer. It had already taken its place. He reached down, picking up a small piece of wood and placing it gently into the fire, the flames lifting slightly, casting a warmer light between them. And for a moment, the world felt smaller, not confined, but held, like everything that mattered existed within that circle of light, and the quiet beyond it. Lyra watched the fire, then slowly, without hesitation, she shifted closer, not enough to close the space completely, but enough that the distance between them no longer felt like separation, just space shared. And Caleb noticed, of course he did, but he did not react, did not move away, did not question it, because there was nothing to question anymore. The choice had already been made, not in words, not in ceremony, but in every moment they had remained where they were, when leaving would have been easier. The fire cracked softly, sending a small trail of sparks upward into the night, disappearing as quickly as they rose, and Caleb found himself watching them, the way they lifted, then faded, and he realized something that settled deeper than anything else that day had brought. Nothing about this was temporary, not because it would last forever, but because it had already become part of what was, part of the land, part of the life he had built, and that was something that did not disappear easily. Lyra's voice came again, softer now, almost like a thought spoken aloud. I will not leave this place. Caleb nodded once, his gaze still on the fire. I know, he said, and there was no question in it, no doubt, just certainty, the kind that comes when something has proven itself without needing to be explained. The night continued around them, steady, quiet, the stars stretching wider across the sky, and as the fire burned lower, the space between what had been and what would be grew smaller until it no longer felt like two separate things. Only one continuous path, and Caleb sat there, unmoving, grounded in a way he had not felt in years, and understood something simple, something final. Out here, a man did not need to say what mattered, he only needed to stay. And as the last of the fire settled into embers and the land breathed slow and even around them, that was exactly what he did.